Nintendo 64. When people talk about the worst video game of all time, Superman 64 is almost always in the conversation. Released in 1999 for the Nintendo 64, it promised players the chance to step into the boots of the Man of Steel. What they got instead was one of the most broken, baffling, and frustrating experiences ever burned onto a cartridge. Right from the start, players were greeted with the infamous ring missions. Instead of fighting villains or saving Metropolis, Superman is forced to fly through endless green hoops within a strict time limit. The flight controls are so stiff and unresponsive that simply steering through a straight line feels like wrestling the controller, and when you're not flying through rings, the game doesn't get better. Enemies glitch constantly, and the draw distance is so short that everything beyond a few feet is covered in a thick, ugly fog. Developer Titus Interactive blamed hardware limitations, but critics and fans weren't buying it. The game was panned across the board, with IGN giving it a 3.4 out of 10 and others calling it nearly unplayable. Even Superman's biggest fans couldn't stomach it. To this day, Superman 64 isn't just shorthand for a bad game, it's a punchline. Atari 2600. No conversation about terrible games is complete without mentioning E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial on the Atari 2600. Released in 1982, it was supposed to be a blockbuster tie-in to one of the most beloved movies of all time. Instead, it became the poster child for rushed development and one of the biggest disasters in gaming history. Atari famously gave developer Howard Scott Warsaw only about 5 weeks to design and code the entire game in time for Christmas. The result? A confusing mess where players guided E.T. around blocky forests and cities, endlessly falling into pits while trying to collect phone pieces. Climbing out of those pits was an exercise in frustration. You'd slip back down repeatedly, turning minutes into hours of maddening trial and error. Kids expecting a magical adventure like the movie instead got what felt like punishment. Word spread fast, returns piled up, and millions of unsold cartridges sat in warehouses. The disaster was so infamous that Atari eventually buried truckloads of the game in a New Mexico landfill, a story that became an urban legend until the cartridges were literally dug up years later. 3DO. The 3DO promised to be the future of gaming in the mid-1990s, boasting cutting-edge graphics and CD-ROM storage. But when people talk about its legacy today, one game overshadows all the rest. Plumbers Don't Wear Ties. Released in 1994, it's often considered one of the worst games, not just on the 3DO, but ever. Marketed as a romantic comedy interactive adventure, it turned out to be little more than a sloppy slideshow of still images stitched together with awkward narration. Players expected full motion video, a major selling point of CD-based gaming, but instead were given poorly lit photographs of actors posing through bizarre scenes. The supposed story involves a plumber, a businesswoman, and a tangle of random scenarios, but nothing makes sense, and your choices barely matter. To make matters worse, the production values are rock bottom. The audio is muffled, the script reads like a parody, and the game constantly veers into awkward territory, mixing cringeworthy comedy with absurd attempts at edginess. Even by the wild standards of 90s FMV games, this one stood out as a train wreck. Critics and collectors alike point to Plumbers Don't Wear Ties as the 3DO's ultimate embarrassment. Instead of showcasing the future, it showed how quickly bad design could turn cutting edge into a joke. Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis was home to some of the most beloved games of the 90s, from Sonic the Hedgehog to Streets of Rage, but it also carried one of the most infamous fighting game disasters of all time, Rise of the Robots. Released in 1994, it was hyped as the next evolution of the genre, with sleek pre-rendered graphics and revolutionary AI. In reality, it turned out to be one of the worst reviewed fighter games ever made. The problem started with the combat itself. Moves felt sluggish and unresponsive, with inputs that barely registered. Many characters only had a handful of attacks, and the supposed advanced AI simply repeated the same moves over and over. To make matters worse, only one fighter was playable in the single-player campaign, leaving the rest of the flashy-looking robots stuck in versus mode. Critics quickly tore it apart. The glossy graphics that once looked impressive in previews couldn't hide the fact that the game had no depth, no speed, and no fun. Instead of rivaling Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter II, Rise of the Robots became a joke. For the Genesis, which had a library full of great fighters, this game stood out as the absolute low point. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button down below. I'll be posting more videos here daily. SNES. The Super Nintendo is remembered as one of the greatest consoles ever made with timeless classics like Super Metroid, but even legends have their low points. And for the SNES, one of the most notorious disasters was the port of Pit Fighter. Originally an arcade brawler that used digitized actors for its characters, Pit Fighter already had a reputation for being bad. But when it was squeezed onto the SNES, things went from bad to worse. Animations were stripped down, the graphics looked muddy and washed out, and the game ran at a snail's pace. The controls, never great to begin with, became borderline unplayable. Punches and kicks came out with huge delays, and hit detection felt completely random. To make matters worse, nearly all of the arcade's energy was lost in translation. Crowds that once felt interactive now stood frozen in the background, and the over-the-top attacks were dulled into awkward, stiff motions. Players expecting the SNES to deliver a faithful arcade experience were left with what many critics called one of the console's worst fighters. With a library stacked full of incredible beat-em-ups, from Final Fight to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the SNES didn't deserve this embarrassment. Pit Fighter became the definition of a lazy, broken port. Game Gear. The Sega Game Gear was meant to be Sega's answer to the Game Boy, a full-color handheld that packed more power and flash. But even with some great ports and hidden gems, it wasn't safe from disasters. One of the most infamous was Sonic Labyrinth, released in 1995. It's often remembered as the Sonic game that completely forgot what made Sonic so great. Instead of the trademark speed and momentum that defined the series, Sonic Labyrinth slowed everything to a crawl. The plot revolved around Dr. Eggman tricking Sonic into wearing cursed shoes that robbed him of his speed, which already set the tone for disaster. Gameplay shifted to a sluggish, isometric maze crawler where Sonic waddled around collecting keys to unlock exits. The controls felt awkward and imprecise, with weird turning that made every level a chore. The decision baffled fans. Sonic was Sega's mascot because he was fast and fluid. Stripping that away left a game that felt more like punishment than fun. Critics slammed it, and even die-hard Sonic fans struggled to defend it. Today, Sonic Labyrinth is a punchline in Sonic's long history. The game that literally took away the one thing that made him special. Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn is remembered for bold experiments and hidden gems, but it also hosted one of the strangest RPG disasters of the 90s. Virtual Highlight, released in 1995. On paper, it was supposed to be an updated task on the old-school Highlight series, with 3D visuals and action RPG mechanics. However, it became one of the most ridiculed games on the system. The graphics were its first mistake. The Saturn tried to render sprawling fields and dungeons, but the environments came out as blurry textures slapped on flat terrain, with enemies that looked like awkward cardboard cutouts. The frame rate often chugged into single digits, turning basic movement into a slideshow. Combat wasn't any better. Swinging your sword felt slow, while enemies floated around stiffly, barely reacting when hit. To make matters worse, the game world was randomly generated, which might sound exciting, but only made the adventure feel inconsistent and incoherent. Maps could turn out empty, repetitive, or outright broken, draining any sense of progression. Critics shredded it at release, calling it ugly, confusing, and almost unplayable. For a console competing with the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, Virtual Highlight looked outdated and made the Saturn look out of its element. Atari Jaguar. The Atari Jaguar was marketed as the first 64-bit console, but its library was plagued with half-baked experiments and rushed releases. Few games embody that reputation quite like Kasumi Ninja, a 1994 fighting game that has gone down in history as one of the Jaguar's worst. Clearly designed to cash in on the popularity of Mortal Kombat, Kasumi Ninja featured digitized fighters, gory finishers, and exotic arenas. But instead of slick martial arts, players got some of the clumsiest combat ever burned onto a cartridge. Movements were stiff, hit detection was wildly inconsistent, and the special moves were nearly impossible to pull off. The character roster only made things worse. The lineup included caricatures like a Scottish fighter who literally lifted his kilt to shoot fireballs. What was intended to be edgy and shocking just came off as laughable, even at the time. Combine that with long load times between fights and awkward controls, and the game became more comedy than competition. Critics and players panned it immediately, and it's now remembered less as a serious fighter and more as a joke. On a console already struggling to prove itself, Kasumi Ninja only reinforced the Jaguar's reputation as a commercial misstep. Sega Dreamcast. The Dreamcast is remembered fondly for classes like Soul Calibur, but not every title lived up to the console's potential. One of the most infamous flops was Spirit of Speed 1937, released in 2000. A racing game should deliver excitement, speed, and adrenaline, but this one somehow managed to be slow and painfully dull. Set in the pre-World War II racing era, it put players behind the wheel of vintage cars. While the idea was unique, the execution was a disaster. The controls felt unresponsive, steering was heavy and clunky, and acceleration was so sluggish that it sometimes felt like you were driving through mud. Instead of thrilling speed, races dragged on at a crawl, with little sense of competition or fun. The visuals didn't help. Cars looked blocky, tracks were empty and repetitive, and the audio design did nothing to capture the intensity of racing. Even the menus and presentation had an unfinished, budget quality to them. Critics quickly ripped it apart, calling it one of the most joyless racing games ever made. On a system that boasted arcade-perfect racers like Crazy Taxi and Daytona USA, Spirit of Speed 1937 was an embarrassment, a racing game that forgot to be fast. NES. The NES library is filled with classics that defined entire genres, but it also produced one of gaming's most notorious disasters, Action 52. Released in 1991, it promised 52 games in a single cartridge, a dream come true for kids at the time. What they got instead was a broken, overpriced scam that quickly became a nightmare. Each of the 52 games was barely functional, many crashed outright, while others recycled the same dull mechanics with only minor visual changes. The controls were stiff, hit detection was awful, and levels often ended abruptly or looped endlessly. Some games couldn't even be finished due to bugs. Titles like Ooze, Crybaby, and the hilariously misnamed Thruster became punchlines, showing just how little thought went into the collection. Worse, the cartridge retailed for an absurd $199, a shocking price even back then. Parents who bought it thinking they were getting a bargain quickly realized they'd paid full price for what amounted to broken prototypes. Over time, Action 52 has kept popularity, not because it's fun, but because of how spectacularly it failed. For the NES, a console known for quality, this stood out as the ultimate embarrassment. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment and let me know which game you think was the worst on this list.